It is very important to understand all the mechanisms of microevolution together, because none of these mechanisms ever happen in the environment by themselves. In fact, natural environments rarely ever are in what we call Heidi-Weinberg equilibrium. The environments don't usually have small populations, they usually have large populations. You usually have non-random mating because of proximity and selection effects, so random mating is very, very rare. You're obviously not going to have blockage of migration unless this population lives completely isolated, and it's very, very rare for this to take place in real life. You're also going to have selection because it's always present, unless, of course, there's going to be no environmental pressure. But I can't think of a single environment where that's going to be the case. And of course, mutations will always occur because of errors on the DNA copy process, which are, where we talked about in the taxonomy lecture series, are actually quantifiable because they happen at a specific rate depending on how many cells are being copied and how many corrections actually have to take place and how often those corrections are not necessarily picked up. So either way, all these effects will therefore be happening together. Small populations will be susceptible to random events which will cause genetic drift, including bottleneck effects and founder effects. You're going to have non-random mating because of selection, isolation, and proximity. You're going to have migration taking place, which brings genes to the environment. You're going to have selection taking place, and you're going to have new mutations also arising. So to do an example of this, if you look, for example, at a bacterial community which was originally all green, but then red bacteria evolved in this because of a new mutation that took place. Now, randomly you select a certain group of the population. Maybe you drop a quadrant swab randomly somewhere in a petri dish, and now this quadrant swab is inoculated with a certain group of the population. But only randomly, whatever was there is now in the cotton swab. So maybe if there was more green than red, that's going to be your population. So that's what we call the bottleneck effect, right? A random event reduced the size of the population and it reduced the composition of the population. Even though red was more beneficial, the population is going to become suddenly more common in green because of randomly landing on top of things which are more green than red. Now, if this a population actually flows from one petri dish to another, that's what we call genetic flow, gene flow, and that's migration. And then you carry those genes forward, now you're going to change the population that was there in the first place. And so maybe you're going to have more green than red now because more greens came with the random one that you picked up. And that's what we call the gene flow. Similarly, if you bring a gene to a place that there had no people there before, and you start the petri dish from scratch, then all the population in that petri dish will be based off the ratio that you start with, and all of a sudden you see more green than you see red, even though red is more beneficial. So that's what we call the founder effect. But if red is really truly more beneficial, over time, natural selection will make red become more common. It will essentially fixate the gene towards the red. So you see, especially since the red will probably choose to mate with the red because it's more common, and because they'll probably tend to go towards each other and form non-random mating. And so you have to put all these concepts together to really try to understand how microevolution actually takes place. And a good way to think about it is if you look at the diversity that exists in the American population, for example. Throughout history, the population that lives endemically in the Americas has changed so much. Originally, it was a lot of Native American Indian population because of the founder effect. Those were the people who actually crossed the Bering Bridge, and descendants from those people were the ones that colonized the United States of America first. And that's why a lot of the people who were around were looking kind of like Native American Indians, because all of them came from the same founders. All right, but then Europeans come, gene flow happens, and then the population mix will change. In the 13 colonies, we'll have a lot more of that than this. But see, they were more adapted to survive. They had better guns. They had more immunity to disease. And all before you know it, selection takes place, and a lot of the Native American populations go down. And that kind of stuff happens. Then you have severe winters, and then all of a sudden a lot of people die because of this. And selection again takes place, and the population starts to change over time as well. Then you might also have the effects of certain things like, randomly certain groups will be the ones which will survive. And sometimes massive disasters take place, and sometimes only that group that was living there, which was not exposed to the massive disaster, tends to survive. And now all of a sudden those are the only kinds of Native American Indians that actually let to survive. And they're the only ones that actually survive to continue being part of the population. But historically, several migration events have taken place in the U.S. You have Irish migrations, German migrations, Jewish migrations, Italian migrations, Asiatic groups migrations, Hispanic migrations. And you bring all those genes into the gene pool, and you're going to keep adding color to this gene pool. And before you know it, a lot of homogeneity happens, and we're all kind of mixed in together. And that's what we call gene flow. But then, at the same time, new mutations will be occurring in the American population, and slowly but surely, mutations were taking hold. But not if the population size is too large. But of course, it's, again, another random effect would happen. The population would again change. So you see, the reason why the odds preparation is the way it is because of a succession of selection events, migration events, non-random mating events, and population size changes. You know, by the way, non-random mating is definitely a factor because historically we have mated with groups that kind of look like us, you know, because of social and political constraints, you know, but that's changing. And so you're also going to change the composition of the population because that's changing, you know. So that's a perfect example of how the factors all have to interact in order for microevolution to actually take place and change the composition of the population. But arguably, that's very different from the kind of evolution that most people think about when they think about evolution, which is the evolution of a new kind of species. What we're seeing here is a change in the human species within the U.S. In other words, the population of the U.S. is changing over time, but it's still humans. You're just getting different kinds of humans living in that place. Macroevolution is when you're going to have enough differentiation existing between the population and enough isolation, enough continuous change, enough continuous drift, enough continuous selection to the point that the populations are so distinct from each other that they no longer can do interbreeding, and then you have two different species. But in the modern society, when there's a lot of gene flow and a lot of exchange and a lot of constant sexual reproduction among different populations around the world, it's very rare for you to see this evolution taking place. And so that's why the lack of isolation is actually slowing down the human evolution, especially since we're being able to deal with the pressures of the environment a little more, since modern medicine has reduced the mortality rate of what the environment can actually cause to us, and we're living longer and longer lives. All right? So that is microevolution, and on the next video, we're going to be focusing a little bit more on the types of evolution and on the types of selection that take place, and to understand a little bit more about how evolution actually happens. I'll see you guys then.